Okay, so this is the final part of the second session, and I'm just going to run through, as we did with the first week, some aspects of the reading. This is going to be fairly short, and just say a little bit about the tasks that I've set you for this week. So this week's article is by Lee and Shemilt. Is any explanation better than none? That's from the Teachers Magazine Teaching History. This is them kind of looking back over a lifetime of work really and summarising, extracting some of the key ideas over a sequence of articles. Lee and Shemilt were two of the leading researchers in the Project Chatter research that I mentioned when we were talking about causation in the second part of this week's lecture. So as with last week, you can listen to this as a pre-reading briefing, or you can come to this as a way to reflect on the article. It's up to you how you want to do it. I'm just going to say this, that I'm not going to go through their sequence in detail, because you can read that, and they give it to you in two formats, in the coloured blocks and in their text. I just want to re-emphasise here, their key idea is that we can identify some broad levels of progression in how children think about historical causation. And that's important because it fits into this broader notion of how we seek to explain things in history. So the model progresses from a simple and rather naive way of understanding something like this. It happened because it happened. And they give some examples of children basically arguing that the First World War happened because of the assassination of the Archduke. Why was the Archduke killed? Well, to start the war. That these just become comparable and equal. They're just different ways of saying the event that started the war. But then we move up to a much more sophisticated, it happened because other things did or didn't happen, and because, given the prevailing conditions, this range of outcomes was possible, but if some conditions changed, it may not have happened. So a much more sophisticated way of constructing an explanation as to why something happens. Very different from how we'd explain why something happens in science. So a very historically informed way of accounting for causation. They warn us, it seems to me important in their article, against some common teaching strategies. So they say be careful against prematurely sorting factors into types or into sequence, because this can encourage children to see them as things rather than relationships, and it can de-emphasize how they act together as causes. So that's a useful warning, I think, and it reiterates one of the tips in the lecture on causation. They also warn against focusing too soon on mimicking the stylistic devices of historians when writing about causation. They say this can achieve a facade of historical style without tackling the real causal reasoning behind the narrative. And I think that's aimed really at a recent teaching trend which focuses, and this is generally a good thing, but it focuses on learning about genres of writing. So one way in which a historian, a history teacher in the classroom might teach children to write about causation is to model some historical texts which provide a causal explanation. And children can mimic the language. They can be given sentence starters to give them a structure to explain themselves. But Lee and Shemilt are really reminding us that we need to just focus first on getting the reasoning developed, and then we can worry about putting it into a finer literary form. And there is certainly a tendency in some English classrooms to move swiftly to a polished piece of work and forget that actually there's some real deep cognitive effort that needs to be put into understanding exactly what it is we want to explain. So they also make this suggestion, and it seems that this comes out fairly strongly towards the end of their work, that, and we certainly haven't mentioned it yet really, the use of the counterfactual in the classroom, which is basically just kind of getting people to speculate on, well, what if? So if we really understand the lead up to the Second World War, is it possible to say, well, what if Hitler died in 1939? Would the Second World War still happen? What if their military strategy of blitzkrieg, the invasion of Poland, wasn't as successful? So that's useful I mean, it's problematic, some people say, because it's introducing an element of fiction. There's no end to, well, what if this happened or that happened? And it's difficult enough to get children to understand history accurately without introducing a kind of fictional counter-history. But Lee and Shemilt have a really valid point, I think, which is that this is a really good way of testing children's understanding of causal connections. Because if they have put together this complicated web of causal connections and you take one out, they have to then adapt their account, and they have to weigh up the different causal factors. They have to recalculate how those things would be connected together in order to come up with a sensible and justifiable conclusion about whether the war would have happened if certain factors were removed, or if things happened in a slightly different order. So with the slight caveat that this can be problematic if overused, I think there's very good reason for going with Lee and Shemilt's suggestion. But again, in the earlier lectures we were talking about the sequence of things, and if it makes sense to start off by teaching some of the factual content so that people actually have some raw material to work with when they're making judgments about causation and significance. And then Lee and Shemilt are saying, actually, then there's another level further on, which is we can then start to adjust those causal factors with counterfactuals. Then that's another level on from just teaching facts. It's another opportunity to get children to think in slightly abstracted, explanatory terms. So it has great value, but I think great value placed in a kind of logical teaching sequence, and you certainly wouldn't want to use counterfactuals too early on. Now, the authors emphasise that we should focus on helping children explain the nature of causal connections, not just putting things in order or identifying something as a concept, as a causal factor, but focusing on the nature of the connection. So here's just a really practical suggestion from my own teaching experience that would give you a way to develop this and experiment with this in practice if you wanted to use this in the classroom. So we might prepare a set of cards for children, much like the ones that we looked at in the lecture on causation. All the cards have true facts, but they're not all immediately relevant to explaining the question we have in hand. And so we have a large sheet of paper, which we refer to as the zone of relevance, and the first thing children have to do with their cards is to sort out what's relevant and what's not. So here factor 5 and factor 2 aren't relevant to the inquiry that we're looking at, the thing we're trying to explain, and so they go off the zone of relevance, the others are on the zone. So that's one kind of judging causal factors. So we've got all the causes now on the pink sheet of paper. The next teaching activity is to ask the kids to relate these factors to each other. So having stuck them down, they then connect them with bits of string or with felt tip lines, and then with a different colour card they have to write in what the connection is, so what explains that connection. And it's these connections which become significant to explaining the nature of causation. And we can also see that this would build up to a web of causal explanation rather than necessarily just a linear causal explanation. So we are also beginning to move into these slightly more sophisticated models of how we'd explain causation. So this seems to me a kind of very practical teaching activity that you could use to try out some of Lee and Shemilt's ideas in practice. So having said that, that leads us into the task. I'm just asking you to identify a lesson you've taught on causation. So that's any lesson you've taught on any topic where you spent a substantial amount of time answering the question, why did X happen? Just outline for me the topic you're exploring. So what was the event you were looking at and what's the context in which you were studying it? Tell me a little bit briefly how you approached the idea of causation. Did you just list the factors? Did you sort the factors into different types of category? Did you talk about whether they were important or not? And then I want you, drawing on some of the ideas we've covered in today's lecture, to describe an alternative strategy you could use in a similar lesson, so the same topic, but use one or more of the examples from the reading or from the lecture slides and just explain how you could reteach that topic, but be more explicit about trying to prompt the children to really explore the nature of causation in relation to the topic you're looking at. And then just post up a summary. It won't be the whole, your whole thinking process, but post up a summary with more of the words for part 3. So just use 100 or 200 words just to kind of explain the topic and say what you did, and then use the bulk of it to explain a strategy that you would use that is slightly revised or advanced in order to kind of plumb for a bit more depth and a bit more conceptual content in how children grapple with this notion of causation. Okay, so that's the end of today's lecture. We'll come back to this notion of second order conceptual frameworks in history when we come and look at the other long sessions. But in the meantime, causation and significance are useful to get your teeth stuck into, I think, and they can be quite fun for children. So I'll leave you to go and work on this, and I look forward to seeing your comments online.